philosopher. On the point of beauty. The claim is that holding to a principle of beauty is a good sort of thing. The loathsome Carlson so happens to be making this claim ATM, but it is hardly a novel sort of claim. Vaush's hot-ass take on this is Hitler was a vegetarian, therefore vegetarianism is Nazism. It's super dumb. As it pertains to beauty specifically, he is holding that he's got some secret lore about the history of politics that enlightens him to the point of noting that the Nazis justified some of their positions via beauty, which is true, but is hardly a secret or hard to come by. Hitler also justified his moral superiority via his commitment to vegetarianism. I swear, if we let Hitler's poor use of good things and justifications rule the day, we are seriously fucked and deserve what comes to us. History is filled with counterexamples to Vaush's tacit complaint, namely, the complaint that to adhere to a principle of beauty as a moral or social standard entails some kind of Nazism. Many, perhaps most cultures have utilized this principle in one form or another, and it is something of a foundational claim in Western philosophy. The utilization of beauty as a stabilizing moral principle is valid and sound. Oh sorry, that's smart people talk. It's based in red-pilled or whatever. Here we can see Vaush's utter lacking of moral/ethical stance shining through too. As he says, there being no objective good or evil, these things merely being utilitarian socio-cultural agreements, it becomes moral to queer bash if/ when there is broad cultural agreement to do so. Never forget, Vaush is an individualist and cultural relativist primarily. His opinion is only ever going to culture says good, so good, or individual says good, so good, he's literally got nothing else. If and when culture says queer bashing good, Vaush becomes philosophically committed to agreeing. If and when an individual says queer bashing good, Vaush becomes philosophically committed to agreeing. He might object, but he will inevitably be doing so via some other methodology of understanding good and evil, right and wrong, etc. He just won't say so.
That human person, I honestly don't get how anyone could think morality is objective. To use your example, could you explain why queer bashing is objectively evil? Without appealing to any collective agreements?
Philosopher. Sure, I can try, but it may be a long explanation. Apologies for that. Firstly, don't mistake me as saying that I necessarily agree with these, but these are some of the more common versions of supposed objective morality that can be found in philosophy. 1. Famously, somewhat infamously, there are categorical imperatives. These are imperatives and hence, oughts, moral axioms that adhere a priori, that is, through reason alone. They are supposed to be true regardless of any a posteriori facts, that is, regardless of the experiential facts of the matter. Hence they are categorical and not merely nominal imperatives. That is what makes them objective. Kant's famous for this, for his theory that there are objective morals, but there is only one, and that one is act only on the maxim you would at the same time will as universal law. In theory, though, there could be an indeterminate number of objective moral reasons derivable via reason alone, that are categorically true, and that would hold true regardless of any facts about the world. Queer bashing would be objectively wrong in this model because as a principle it is not something you would want to enact as a universal law. Because you know, you or someone you love might be queer. Technically though, it is because doing so would cause an internal contradiction of the reasons. Or so the argument goes. 2. A lesser, difficult to grasp notion is that there might be moral reasons that are true regardless of the society. In this version, morals are things that apply to, let's say people or morally relevant agents if we want to put it more broadly, but they are true regardless of the society to which we are speaking of. In other words, they are not dependent upon agreements of people, they simply describe moral actions within the context of any social interactions between peoples. For example, it could be pretty well argued that something like individual freedom to choose is an objective moral principle that is applicable to any society whatsoever. Although it is a bit of a stretch, one can get a sense of that argument being made in the Leviathan by Hobbes, whereby he argues that even in an absolutist monarchy given by divine right, there are still the rights of individuals to choose to die. Hence, the right to choose to die would be an objective moral that is applicable to any society, as an absolutist monarchy given by divine right is pretty much the most authoritarian society one can really imagine. Or so the argument goes. Queer bashing would be wrong because they make for bad social orderings of any society whatsoever. This is actually a pretty strong argument for it being objectively wrong, imho, because queer folks actually are fundamental structures of any society whatsoever. But such would be the argument. 3. Speaking of divine rights, one of the most common versions of objective morals is that they are derived via the divine. Now, think what you want of the argument for the existence or not of the divine. The point here, though, is that it is a pretty straightforward argument for objective morals. They are objective because they are derived from the divine, and the divine either cannot be wrong or manifestly makes it right. Either way, it is objective. Queer bashing would be objectively wrong under this mode of thought because the divine said so, enough said. For possible worlds argument, if there are morals that obtain in all possible worlds, then it follows that such is an objective moral. It is straightforward and similar, though more rigorous than solution 2. Queer bashing would be objectively wrong in this mode of thought if there were no possible world whereby it can logically obtain its morality. I personally find this mode of thought a bit weak, but it is actually fairly popular in modern philosophy. 5. The veil of ignorance. This notion is from Rawls and is a major undergirding ethical principle of thought in current liberalism, not the political movement, the philosophical one. It holds that if we imagine that we are coming up with ethical principles that are going to apply to us, but we don't know who we are going to be, we can thereby derive objective morals. It might be helpful to think of it like, pretend you're a spirit waiting to be born. You know you're going to be a human, but you don't know where you'll be born, what sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, social class, etc. And you are tasked with coming up with a set of moral principles that you are willing to live with. The claim is that behind that veil of ignorance, you can derive objective moral principles. Queer bashing would be objectively bad because you don't know if you're going to be queer, and hence you wouldn't want any laws or moral principles that bash you, just like you wouldn't do to race, class, gender, etc. 6. I'll give this last bit of proper intuition on the matter and leave it there. The trolley problem. Most folks on the internet are familiar with the trolley problem. The point of the trolley problem is that there is no ethically correct answer to it via utilitarian analysis. Either choice is given is an ethically bad choice. One is literally choosing to murder someone's. The point of that exercise is to recognize that there is something objectively wrong with murder. There isn't some further principle to it. It is just wrong no matter what way you cut it. Pun intended. There are no scenarios whereby murder is ethically permissible, and hence it is objectively wrong. This is a kind of proof via reason, a kind of a priori proof, where one runs through all the possible permutations and arrives at some kind of conclusive point. Murder, big duh, is actually a bad thing. Note though that murder is different from killing or justifiable murder in self-defense, etc. These having either no moral connotations to them, killing, or are carved out exceptions, justifiable murder. One can get a sense of the no queer bashing argument by just playing with the scenario a bit. Imagine there are 2 queers or 3 straights, and you have to bash one group or another. Neither choice is good, cause bashing people is bad, hence bashing the queers is just objectively bad. Not my favorite argument, but that is how that argument would run. I hope that helps some. If you want to talk about it more, I am willing to discuss if you'd like.
They that human person. Thanks for taking the time to respond. After reading through all your examples, only the divine one actually seems objective to me. Because there's no agreements needed, morality is just whatever the divine being says. But the other examples rely on 2 main agreements. 1. Human well-being is a thing we should care about. 2. A functioning society is something desirable. This might sound stupid, like these aren't really agreements because they're default positions for everyone. They actually aren't. More on that later, but something being accepted by everyone doesn't make it objective. Consider this. Why should morals be structured around what's good for humans in the first place? Say you're given the choice between saving the life of a human or an ant. Can you really say that saving the human is the objectively correct choice? I don't think you can. Because behind that choice is the subjective belief that human life is more valuable. Hell, even the belief that life is valuable at all is subjective. Ask an antinatalist and they'll tell you plenty about how birthing new life is immoral because you can't consent to being born. These people sure don't care about maintaining a functioning society in the long term, because the end point of their philosophy is our literal extinction.
Philosopher. I appreciate your response. I think the assumption some of the examples I gave made is that morality is a thing that obtains within social structures. Doesn't matter if society is a desirable thing or not though. Society could be an undesirable thing, but morality only obtains within it. If we are speaking of morality, then we are necessarily speaking of societies. There just isn't any such thing as morality sans society. Hence, if it is true of all social structures as such, it is objectively true. I suspect you are mistaking necessary preconditions for morality to obtain as being a part of the questions of morality as such. A necessary condition for morality is the living of human life, or more broadly, of the lives of morally relevant agents. There isn't any sort of moral attachment or agreements being made there. There simply just isn't any morality at all without them. It is very much like noting that there wouldn't be any rocks if there wasn't any existence at all. Existence is just a precondition to there being rocks, but existence isn't itself a rock. A priori principles are generally thought to be objectively true BC. They aren't dependent upon anything but logic or sometimes reasonableness. The logic or reasons given may be flawed, but provided that they are not, they are necessarily true and hence objectively true. To be clear, logic and reason don't care if you agree with it or not. Their truth-functional relations are not predicated upon agreement, though one's access to them or acceptance of them may be. I'd go so far as to suggest that the term objective truth is somewhat derivative of this concept. Subjective truth being something that is true predicated upon experiences in the world relative to a person or perhaps a culture. Another term that is mostly synonymous with subjective truth is contingent truth, e.g., it is true predicated upon some nominal aspects of the world. Objective truth is something that is true while not being dependent upon experiences in the world, or which is applicable regardless of the nominal instantiations, such as, for instance, mathematics, logical principles, etc. That's kind of what those terms just mean. That makes sense to you? In the cases you mentioned, an objective moral truth is different from an objective fact in that there can be instantiations in the world that don't adhere to it. In other words, people can just be wrong. So the persons who make claims about preferring not to be born don't detract from the argument for an objective moral truth. They could just be wrong. If murder is objectively immoral, that doesn't mean no one can murder. It just means no one ought to murder. I kinda strongly suspect that this distinction is tripping you up and is a stumbling block for many folks, perhaps especially folks who argue for some kind of utilitarian/cultural relativist viewpoint. Objective facts don't have instantiations that are counter to them. Red doesn't become green just because someone decides to do so. Objective morals, however, can have instantiations that are counter to them. Again, it may be objectively immoral to queer bash folks, but nonetheless folks may instantiate that immorality. This is often enough part of the mystery and questions surrounding morality, ethics, and for what it's worth questions of free will. To answer your points more directly, morals might be structured around humans because they are morally relevant agents. This is a technical term, usually justified by some version of the having of reason, free will, a soul, or some other distinguishing feature about them, such that morality becomes a relevant feature of them, human or ant. The distinguishing between these would depend on some version of the above. If that isn't clear, consider the difference between smashing a rock or an ant. There is a something about the ant that the rock doesn't have that makes the latter of little consequent and former of some consequent. The human, or more broadly the morally relevant agent, has something about them that invokes a relevancy to morality at all. Those are the mysteries and the questions of morality, ethicity, and so forth. Or part of it at any rate. What is that thing to which we are referring to in our, intuitions on the matter? What is that thing to which folks agree to use the language of the cultural relativist and the individualist? Certainly one might want to know to what exactly are the things one is agreeing to before blithely agreeing, or holding to some insipid position that the mereness of the agreement to what is the thing of note. So yes, it actually can be pretty easy to say that the human is more meaningful, valuable to save than the ant, for possibly a wide variety of reasons. It's not even clear that the ant is a relevant moral agent at all, but if they are, which for what it's worth I tend to think they are, it is highly unlikely they obtain as much of the morally relevant aspects as a human. No one would miss them. They may not really have much in the way of free will, logic, reasonableness to them. I'm honestly uncertain if they'd feel pain or even care at all if they die. To be entirely antagonistic to the point, humans are far and away more beautiful than the ant. Now, any of those reasons for justification of moral relevancy may be discussable, debatable, etc. But they are what folks are tending to talk about when they talk about moral relevancy.
They that human person. There's much I could respond to here, but I'm going to laser focus on just one part of your comment to keep the discussion from getting out of hand. In response to the antinatalist point, you say that people can just be wrong. That things like murder can be objectively immoral and that the people who murder are just wrong in doing so. Thing is, wrong according to what objective standard? Because again, in the case of a divine being it's clear, but not so much otherwise. What objective standard are you using to determine murder is wrong?
Philosopher. I have already given you several common and widely accepted versions of objective morality. There isn't actually much controversy in the academics of it as to if those are examples of objective morality. There are arguments that could be made as to if they are correct or not, if the reasoning or logic is sound, but in terms of if they are objective or not, there isn't any real disagreement to be had. Or rather, if there is, it is incumbent upon you to make the argument, which I would welcome to discuss the points with you. But here you are merely reiterating that you don't personally believe that they are objective. Your earlier comment gave some reasons as to why, which is good, but I responded to those, and that is where the discussion would lay, if it lay anywhere at all. To answer your question in this comment directly, any of the provided examples are sufficient in reply. 1. It is objectively wrong because it cannot be willed as universal law without contradiction. 2. It is objectively wrong because social structures only functionally operate with it being so, and morality only obtains via social structures. 3. It is objectively wrong because the divine says so. 4. It is objectively wrong because there is no possible world whereby it isn't. 5. It is objectively wrong because behind the veil of ignorance people would choose to make the law such that murder is wrong. 6. It is objectively wrong because, as the trolley problem objectively and experimentally demonstrates via the internet's massive permutations of it, there is no valid solution to the problem whereby murdering provides a morally satisfactory solution. Again, these are not controversially objective moral standards. It is incumbent upon you to make some kind of argument to show that they are not. The weight of the Academy, in other words, disagrees with you. There are arguments to be had, don't get me wrong, but you're not making them here. You're merely stating a personal belief on the matter. I certainly welcome any argument you might want to make towards them, and perhaps the discussion would do better by choosing some other aspect of my previous comment to respond to.
Feel free to continue this conversation with an actual philosopher and feminist in the comments section.